Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Dr. Vishwanath Venkatesh for his keynote titled Empowering Women Through ICT, Evidence from Rural India.
Okay. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here at Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham, and we're gathered here with the blessings of Amma to be able to continue this conversation about gender and technology. What I'd like to do over the next 15 minutes is to talk to you about a project which is summarizing work that we did for about 15 years in rural India. And what I want to focus on with this is the evidence. And the fact that the evidence that I'm going to share with you, which, the project again began about 20 years ago, is really a testimony to the fact that things can change dramatically. It does take time. And as we're talking a lot about technology, it's not only the technology. The social change is a very important part, even as Amma was talking about this to us yesterday and also in her inaugural address about how, for example, men need to help with paving the way for women, and we need to work together in several ways. So those would not be the parts that I address, but it's part of what makes this, all these, the things that I'm going to share possible. So that's one thing. And the second thing, because this is a academic institution, and there are many research scholars here, faculty members here, who are interested in doing such work, such societally relevant, impactful work, but also publishing this work, especially in good journals. And part of what I will share with you quickly is the evidence that journals do welcome work which is societally relevant. Being in the business school myself, the journals that I'll talk about where we've published our work are the business journals. But again, that the journals do want to see it, because often scholars in India are surprised to hear that journals would care about problems, phenomena, solutions, evidence from India. So, this is evidence that they would care about evidence from India. So our setting is really a part of a very large project of a multinational corporation. And we collected data in 10 villages over a period of 7 years initially, and then we expanded our data collection to be about 50 villages. And the way these 800 villages and the 10 villages were chosen and the data were collected, these at that time were villages that did not have running water or electricity, did not have access by motorable road for the last 5 to 10 kilometers. So access itself was limited. So we're really talking about villages that were very remote in India at the time when the work started, all 800. In addition to the 10 villages, so the 800 villages that were identified were a target of an intervention, an ICT intervention, technological intervention at that time, was essentially an internet-enabled computer. Simple as that. Technology has changed a lot. Access is a lot easier now. And the adjacent villages were those villages where the intervention was not actively implemented. But of course, one of the things that we do know in the world in general, in villages especially, in rural India especially, that there would be spillover effects. So we're comparing the intervention villages with what are called the control group villages in order to see, well, is there a significant impact that can be detected due to the intervention. Our project timeline, as I mentioned, is about the initial part of the work was really about collecting data over a period of about 8 years. And the data collection was very intensive. We were talking, about how the data collection it happens For us, it was all through individual interviews and collecting data longitudinally, meaning collecting data from the same people repeatedly, and also collecting data using archival sources, government sources, and various other primary and secondary sources in order to get economic impact data, healthcare related data, mortality data, and so on. So that's the overall project timeline. In terms of what data we collected a lot of data about the villages themselves to see where they are geographically located, what type of crops are being grown there, how the technology intervention was actually implemented in terms of both the implementation and also oversight, the role of the panchayats in the process, and so on. Individual data, household data, were collected using a survey, but it was a survey that was done using interviews, active interviews, not someone sending a link. Obviously, with literacy being what it is, you're not going to get surveys filled out any other way. And outcomes, as I already mentioned, were collected both through archival sources and also through direct interactions with the people to see how they were doing, how often they were seeing the doctor, for instance, or how their crops were doing, and so on. So it's a very large-scale project, both in terms of the time frame and also in terms of the data that were collected. In terms of the impact, so you can see with the control group that there is, over the 8-year period, an increase in farmer income. If we look at the agricultural price index during this time frame, it was about a 35% change. So the control groups more or less tracked with that. But you can see in the intervention group that there was a significantly higher impact in terms of the income increase, right? Much stronger impact. So technology having an impact based on the information that was available about farming. This would animate a little bit better, but the dotted lines are the control group lines, and the continuous line is the intervention line. And these are mortality statistics. So the mortality statistics, as you know, are tracked as number of deaths for every 1,000 live births, whether it's infant mortality, maternal mortality, or child mortality. And when the project started, the mortality rates in these villages were about where it was in India, in rural India, which was about 70 for every 1,000, right? So which is 7%. It's extraordinarily high, right? And we know that that's a major problem, part of the focus of SDGs, not just SDG 5, but other SDGs as well, SDG 4, and so on. So. But you can see that with the various initiatives that are going on in India, both the central government initiatives and various state government initiatives, there is a decline in this. But if we look at the intervention villages, the difference between the control group villages and the intervention villages is significant, statistically significant. Especially for infant mortality and maternal mortality, it's substantial, right? So, and that's a very important piece of evidence to suggest that we can make a difference through technology. Although the issue of infant mortality, maternal mortality, and child mortality are critical and major problems and challenges to overcome in India and in other less developed countries, the true empowerment comes from greater financial inclusion and other such changes that can happen. In the intervention villages, through the information that was available about entrepreneurial activities, access to loans and grants for entrepreneurial activities for women, the entrepreneurial activity, the number of new businesses started, was 5 times as many in the intervention villages compared to control group villages, right? Which is to say that information technology and the information together, along with various social changes that happen, can have a dramatic impact in terms of increasing entrepreneurial activity and therefore financial inclusion for women. Actually, and when I show you the next picture, which is about the entrepreneurial profit, it's a step function higher among the women who have access to information in terms of conducting the businesses. So the stories that I have to tell you about these are just like, it was just unbelievable about the way in which women were able to transform their businesses, take them online, and do all sorts of fantastic things in order to be, and to be successful. And in many cases, as a result of these businesses, they were actually making more money in the businesses than they were generating from the farms, right? So it's really amazing as to what social change and technology can do for women. And now for the other piece of the evidence, it took a while. I started this project in 2003. It took a while, but we did publish our papers related to this in the leading information systems journals, particularly MIS Quarterly and Information Systems Research. And perhaps the greatest thing for us was we were also publishing it in a management journal, Academy of Management Journal, where we wrote about the story of the success of women entrepreneurs in rural India. It was really about that story. And what sort of evidence we had with regard to the social and the technological change needed to make that impact. So journals do want to and are happy to publish this kind of work. And so my proudest moment as a researcher, aside from being involved in this project, was our paper was actually the best paper in AMJ. I'm not even in the management field. So it was... again, and thank you, but it's really is to say that, if you're working on these projects, gender, technology, social change, the journals do want to publish this sort of work. So, as the work that you're doing here, the work that's going on here at this university, in terms of the research, is something that, the world should hear about. The other thing is that, I know the UN, UNESCO are really involved in this conference, and our project also, I got to go to many UN forums and talk about this success story, including the first time was in Paris at the UNESCO headquarters in 2010, when the division, the UN Women, was launched, was to be able to talk about this project and say, these are the things that we're doing, and here are the things that lead to success, both in terms of technological change and social change. And I'd really emphasize that piece about the social change, because in our studies, after 7-8 years, less than 10% of the women were actually directly using the technology. So which is not to say that the technology doesn't make a difference. It's the information that comes from the technology, the changes that the technology can bring through the information, that actually makes this holistic difference in terms of better healthcare, better quality of life in terms of income, and greater financial inclusion for women. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and enlightening talk. I would like to invite questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Venkatesh. My question it's twofold, but let's do the first question first. Was there any type of societal pushback or backlash against the women who now became very successful entrepreneurs in these villages relative, for example, to maybe the men who are doing more of the farming? This is an assumption, of course. So, I don't know what the breakdown is between the female entrepreneurs versus the male entrepreneurs, but was there any sort of social ostracization or any negative implications for the women being more successful? And if so, were there any sort of further interventions your team did to maybe help mitigate that?
There was actually more of pushback in the earlier stages when they would say, who's going to take care of the kids, or, there's no time, things like that. But when they, I jokingly call this the mother-in-law effect. When I've had these interviews with the mothers-in-law, and they would say, we cannot support this for the following reasons. And as I talk to them each year, as their stance softens a little bit, as the daughter-in-law is more successful, 7 years later, they actually say, well, of course she's successful. It was all my idea, right? And I supported her through this whole journey, which, wasn't entirely true. But back to your question, I think with regard to whether there was pushback or more of jealousy or any other form of negative impacts, I don't think there was too much that we could, because I think, like we were sharing at lunch, I used to spend every other month in India during the course of that project. So I was here for 6 months of the year and really engaged in the villages. So I don't think there was any backlash or any anything that happened after they were successful. But I think during, it was very challenging. For us even to do the interviews, when we said we need to talk to them separately, because as part of our social network data that we were collecting data about who were they connected to, who are hindering what they were trying to do. So these are all things we said, we need to collect this data. We need to talk to them, in private. And that was even a challenge. So I think in the early stages, there are a lot of challenges, but afterwards, I think it smooths out because, they love the economic development. And I think, you all know this all much better. There was a time when there was a change in the law about the panchayats and women having to serve. They need to have at least one woman. And in all of these villages, there were at the end of it, there were more than the legally required one woman. There were 3, 4, 5 on the panchayat, which means they really have earned their seat at the table. And that was when there was more differences in terms of the girls are going to go to school now and things like that. Anyway, I know this is not what exactly you asked, but I think that there was more positive change at the end of it than if there was any, minor backlash. I didn't catch it, and I don't think that was a concern. But it was certainly there in the beginning, so that's an important part of the social parts to overcome. Great question.
That's really great. With a question on that, how did the money get spent? The extra-additional money that came from the female entrepreneurs, did that money, the percentage spent, like, as in, did the woman, maybe if the women were not able to do businesses before, now they have a business, did the money from that business, were the women able to keep that, or was it share 50% with the husband, or was it just 100% the household? Like, and did the spending of the money, were the women able to consume more of that money that they earn, or what happens to the financials afterwards?
So I at least in most cases, it didn't go into a separate account. Some things, of course, were reinvested in the business and the growth of the business. So mostly from our interviews, it seemed like it goes into the common pot, the household pot, and the women had more of a say in terms of what happened than before, when, at least in the early stages, we would pick up that they really didn't have any, they didn't even have any knowledge about how much money was coming in and how this was being managed. So it seemed like they had more of a say in terms of how it was done. They were buying more nice things, as they would say, and gifts for the kids and things like that, which they wanted to do, and they did that. So I would say they had a little bit more of an influence in terms of how it was spent.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So 2 questions. One is, you spoke about technology spillovers. You had an intervention group, you had a control group. So the intervention group exhibited an escalated performance. What about the intervention group? You initially had spoken about some amount of spillovers would have happened across. Did you observe anything there?
Yeah, so we beyond collecting some of the data about the outcomes and maybe sporadic surveys, we didn't really go live in those villages with the control group. So I would say most of the change was due to the inflation or other government initiatives in general, as they had this mobile hospital, things like that, educational incentive, awareness, educational initiatives, awareness initiatives that were taking place. So I think those were having an impact. It's hard to, I don't have any data to tell you, oh, this is the measure of the spillover that took place. But, people talk across the villages, and the villages were generally, when they were adjacent, they were the same community. So there were marriages that were taking place across these villages. So I think there was some sharing, but certainly, when we see these huge differences between the intervention and the control villages, I would say that it's a really conservative test, because in spite of the spillover, we're seeing that the intervention villages are doing so much better, right? So that means that the spillover by itself is not enough. We cannot say, okay, it'll just be in the water, it'll just be in the air. I don't think that that's nearly enough. But I think that it probably had some effect. The only way to tell what would be different is if we get some village that was much more geographically distant, where we would have less interaction, and then see what was happening there. With that data, we don't have.
One more question. During your the graph which you had shown on entrepreneurial activity, it was a step graph.
Oh. Yeah.
It was a step graph. So there was a rise for 2 years. It was plateaued for a year. Again a rise.
Yeah.
Again a plateau. So what was the reason for such a step?
Yeah, I think that there's no I don't have any nuanced explanation about why was it following the trajectory it was. I think it does take a little bit of time. Like in terms of farmer income, I could say, well, it takes a little bit of time to change your farming practices and for that to manifest in terms of impacts. But in terms of entrepreneurial activity, I think that there's an initial burst of interest maybe, and then, cools down a little bit, and then they get more ideas. Maybe. I really don't have a data-driven, interview-based explanation even to tell you why that sort of trajectory happens. But I do know it takes time from what we've seen, Some of the graphs actually really pleasantly surprised me, but it does take time.
Probably your study was done when the importance was not so much on increasing farm income. We have more thrust on by the government programs now to increase the farm income. So given your study, what kind of technologies that would have worked in the agrarian context to raise the farm income?
So the technology was only an internet-enabled computer, right? So it was about providing them more information about farming practices, good farming practices. So there were attempts, I think it's more now, but to bring running water, electricity, etc., as part of that larger project, but it wasn't always happening. So it wasn't that the farming improved, the farming output improved because that was now better irrigation. Nothing like that. It was just farming practices, information, crop rotation, and I learned a lot about farming during this time, and you could see generations of farmers didn't really have, some of the modern practices that were already prevalent in various parts of India, but these remote farmers didn't really have that. So I think it was more about farming practices. And as you said, now that, there's a lot more initiatives and electricity has reached a lot more villages now, I think, which actually, with the change in the technology, it makes it much more realistic to have big impacts on various SDG related goals for India.